Welcome, America. This is Al Palmer, your host for Stars and Stripes, a production of STARS, which is a nonprofit organization which seeks to talk about preserving our nation's military and making sure that they're able to do their job every day to save you, the American public. Well, I'm happy to have a special edition today, and we're going to talk a little bit about one of the most important things in our society. In fact, the one thing that makes us most important in the world these days, and that is the law. Our justice system and the way we pursue it is the one thing that separates American ideals and values from everything else probably in the world. If we don't have the justice system to stand up for the people, then we really don't have a free country. So that's going to be the subject today. And here to help me with that is a very distinguished guest and a part of our STARS family, Michael T. Rose, who's an attorney, a very prominent attorney, who serves as the executive vice president and corporate counsel for STARS. Mike has a jurist degree from New York University School of Law, where he was an editor of the Law Review, and he holds a master's degree in business administration from Harvard Business School. He was awarded the highest professional rating of AV, which is on the bar register of preeminent lawyers, from Martindale-Hubbell. Mike was an associate attorney at a major law firm and has founded and led multiple businesses in his career. Mike was the winner and plaintiff in a landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision about the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, and we'll talk about that some more. He served 4 terms as a Republican state senator in South Carolina and has lectured at various universities, college, professional organizations, and he's been on television a lot, particularly lately. And that includes a stint that he did on CBS 60 Minutes. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Mike to our show tonight. Mike, it's off to you, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Al. Thanks for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me start by identifying myself the way I would. As Al said, I am an attorney. I live in Somerville, South Carolina, about 20 miles from Charleston. I live with my wife, Vivian, in a house built in the 1890s. My daughter lives next door. Our 3 grandchildren grew up next door. And her husband. So we have a safe, comfortable, wonderful life here within walking distance of our town. But I practice law out of my home office, as you can see here. I am a graduate of the Air Force Academy, New York University School of Law, and Harvard Business School. I spent 10 years going to full-time college in my early years, all living in dormitories. I did serve 13 years as a South Carolina state senator. I've started 4 private businesses, and I now am doing what I consider my most important endeavor in my life, which is to serve as executive vice president and general counsel of STARS. STARS stands for Stand Together Against Racism and Radicalism in the Services, Inc. Website stars.us. STARRS.us, 2 R's. And this is important and sort of a culmination of all my experience in the past, which really was 4-faceted: military, political, legal, and business. Because I view the future of our country as in jeopardy, and that's in no small part due to the deterioration of the military, impeding its readiness and ability to defend our country. So I now devote virtually a full-time effort, as I have in the last 4 years, to STARS. The key to understanding what I've done in my life and in my law practice in particular, which I think is substantial, is to understand my early childhood. My father was youngest of 12 children on a Kentucky hillbilly subsistence farm. He joined the Navy the day he turned 17 during World War II. He met my mother one Saturday night at the Inglewood, California USO at a dance. At the end of the war, they got married, hitchhiked across the United States. He took her to the hills of Kentucky. So she went from Los Angeles, movies and so forth, to no indoor plumbing in Kentucky, having 3 children in 4 years. I'm the oldest. So my earliest memories are Navy housing projects, Quonset huts on the east and west coast, where my father, as a Navy enlisted man, was stationed. But due to my family circumstance, I wound up, my brother, sister, and I living with my grandparents in the hills of Kentucky. So we left both parents when I was 7. Now that environment, going from Norfolk, Virginia to Kentucky might as well have been another planet. No indoor plumbing. I ate entire meals of cornbread crumbled up in a milk, standing barefooted at a table while flies, wasps, and dirt daubers flew around. I went to a one-room schoolhouse with one teacher who taught 8 grades, big pot-bellied stove in the middle. The teacher had one leg and literally rode a mule to school. So he put a mule in the barn and then get his way over to the school. I skipped 2 grades in that school in 5 years. I took 5 grades in 3 years. My dad died. My mother remarried an Air Force enlisted man in Charleston, so we moved to Charleston. And I was allowed to keep my grade that I had turned in Kentucky, so I graduated from high school at 16. I wanted to go to the Air Force Academy. I did 3 term papers in high school about the Air Force Academy. So, but I was too young. You have to be 17. I was 16. So I went where the Air Force Academy recommended that I prepare for a year. I went for a year, my first year of college at Marion Military Institute, Marion, Alabama, 30 miles from Selma, Alabama, during the year of the Selma crisis. I did get an appointment to the Air Force Academy after that. I graduated in 1969 after a year of active duty at Lowry Air Force Base, Denver. I went to New York University School of Law on a leave of absence, meaning the Air Force allowed me to go but didn't pay my way, but then I was to be a lawyer in the Air Force afterwards. And so in law school, I understand I'm arriving in New York City and I don't know a soul there. All the 4 colleges I went to, I didn't know anybody in the state and was totally self-sufficient. Even when I went to the Air Force Academy, to me, it was like, I distinctly recall, heaven on earth, even though it was hell on earth. But it really was heaven to me because I saw all this food. I can't eat it yet, but as much as I want, but the beautiful room. So actually, I was lucky from the day I entered the Air Force Academy. I never really had to worry about money like I did before. Anyway, when I got to New York City, I didn't know what LaGuardia Airport was. I didn't even know what a subway was. And the reason I'm telling you this is that my going to these schools was a socioeconomic development of me, not just academic. But I had the insight to pursue the academics. And my perception is that I've gone from one end of the socioeconomic spectrum to the other, basically going from the hills of Kentucky to Harvard Business School. And it was a growth experience for me every step of the way, which I'm very grateful for. But in return, I feel an obligation to give back, and that's what I've done primarily in my law practice. Now, I would just say this, is that a evidence of, I guess I would say, my impact in law is that when I attended Harvard Business School, my second year, I took a course called Power and Influence. Power and Influence. So the 90 students in the class studied how historically certain people had acquired and used power and influence. And one day we studied patent. This is about the case method. So you read a case about patent, and then we discuss it for 90 minutes, 90 students. And then another day, we discuss Mary Kay. And one day while I'm in the class, it was the Mike Rose case. So now the 90 students are discussing what I had done in my law practice or in my life as of age 32. So what are some of the things that I did in my law practice? Let's start with, as a law student on the law review, I had to write about something. I didn't know what law review was, but then I got on it, and now I got to write about something. And I decided to write about the Air Force Academy's honor code because there was no civilian literature had been written about it. So the public really didn't know how it operated. And it was, to me, just going to be a description of how it worked. But I expanded it into a 2.5-year, $18,000 by then those days dollars project, comparing the conduct, honor, and ethics systems of all 5 service academies. And there's a picture of it right there. And if you go to the STARS website and to my bio on the About section, there's a link to that article. But this book, it's 190 plus pages long, over 1,100 footnotes. It took 2.5 years to do. And when it was published, within a week, it immediately got national publicity. And within a week, I was on 60 Minutes regarding this. And a link to that 60-minute segment also is at the bottom of my bio on the stars.us website. But I just want to talk about this for a minute. Understand my perspective is I grew up with, in Kentucky, just at the right age of 7 to 9, where I could absorb what was going on. And these farmers, many of them were in one war or another, World War I, World War II, Korean War, and they had enlisted, and they quickly became NCOs because they were leaders. They were rugged individualists. They knew how to fight. And when the Battle of Bulge started, they didn't need officers to tell them how to fight back. They just did it. And but they were never officers because they didn't have the education required. But I heard these farmers, I'm internalizing this, bragging reverently about West Point Naval Academy graduates. And I remember one uncle actually telling me that the Naval Academy was so hard that as a freshman, you had to stand to attention while the upper class took tweezers and pulled your whiskers out one by one. And for some reason, I said, that's for me. So to me, it was the epitome of achievement to aspire to. And I was already being lauded for skipping grades and being smart. So anyway, when I moved to Charleston, South Carolina, like I said, they let me keep my grade and I graduated at 16. But my point is, these farmers had an attitude, my grandfather certainly did, of disdain for what they call the pretty people. The pretty people were people that were wealthy and powerful. And this may have come from like the 1700s, where the wealthy people on the bi-coastal elites, or it was one coastal elite at that time, would wear their costumes and wigs and so forth. The people in Kentucky judge people by merit, what they could do, not pedigree. And so they had a contemptuous disdain for people that they thought, they called pretty people, that were wealthy and powerful, they thought, instead of them, because they didn't lie, cheat, and steal like the people that were wealthy and powerful. So I had a frame of reference when I got in the military of how people who were enlisted were affected by their leaders and what happened. So when I researched this law review article, I showed that West Point and the Air Force Academy had an honor system conducted in a certain way that was radically different than the Naval, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine Academy. And as of that time, all the cheating scandals were happening at West Point Air Force Academy. So I basically advocated that West Point Air Force Academy changed what the three Safe Service Academies were doing, which is what wound up happening. But also, I identified things at the academies that I concluded were illegal. And I'll just give an example of this. At West Point, the West Point had a practice called the silence. The silence. Now, the origin of the silence had to do with racial discrimination. I interviewed, by writing this paper, Benjamin O. Davis Jr., West Point graduate, class 36, who was the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen. And he confirmed to me what was referenced in his yearbook, West Point yearbook, that he was silenced his entire 4 years at West Point solely for being black. That means no one spoke to him for 4 years. That means that he sat at a table for 3 meals a day, at a table by himself with no one sitting with him, and that nobody roomed with him. He told me this was 99% effective. It started his second day. I asked him he didn't appear to be bitter about this. Why? Because and he was then some kind of undersecretary of Department of Transportation, retired 3-star general. And he said, no, he wasn't bitter, because you got to understand that's how things were back then, that the riots that were occurring at the time that I was interviewing him was because of, with TV, within people, the have-nots were able to see the economic disparities, and it made him angry and so forth. These are my words, not his, but that's what I understood him to say. So I went to West Point authorities with the proof that this was an illegal, this silence was illegal. The regulations of West Point said that if a cadet was found guilty of violating the honor code, then he was entitled, because it was only he's then, to appeal to a board of officers, and if he won his appeal, then he used to be returned to the Corps, quote, in good standing, quote, returned to the Corps in good standing. That's what the regulation said. Well, you're not being returned to the Corps in good standing if you're going to be silenced. And cadets didn't come up with a silence on their own. They were taught that by West Point authorities as they entered West Point. And furthermore, there was a regulation prohibiting conspiracies among cadets against other cadets, which is exactly what they were doing. And I found 2 cadets being silenced. And one of them wound up in that 60 Minutes film that I was interviewed in 1974 at Maury Safer, which again, the link's at the bottom of my bio. And so I was stunned that, wait a minute, we were taught to obey the law and the Constitution at the Academy. I've gone to 5 years military college, and now I'm showing West Point authorities what they're doing is illegal, and they don't care. They're not going to change it. And what I showed is 4 out of 5 academies, a cadet accused of violating the honor code could not be present. That includes West Point, could not be present while the evidence was presented to the honor committee. Well, if you want to get the truth of the matter, the most fundamental procedure is that's required, that's one of the cadets being silent, is to allow the accused to be present while the evidence is presented so they can respond to it. So I thought that was illegal. And at the Air Force Academy, there was a cheating scandal in the early 70s where cadets were pulled out of bed in the middle of the night, stood to the brace, screamed at, threatened with court-martial if they didn't confess, and they had honor hearings around the clock. 2 a.m. was your honor hearing, you went to it. 4 o'clock. You would have thought this was the plague they had to get rid of, but there was no due process. And I might add that one of the key leaders of STARS was the subject of this interrogation process. Now, he didn't have an honor hearing, but I mean, this is not by imagination. This was in an article in our alumni magazine that I received by mail while I'm researching this law review article. And I can give multiple other examples, but think about it. The highest general cannot interrogate the lowest enlisted man in a coercive manner, like pulling them out of bed in the middle of the night and screaming and threatening with court-martial if they don't confess. When what they're being questioned about, they could be prosecuted for under the UCMJ. So why were we at the Air Force Academy teaching future military commanders that when they thought honor was involved, that's the way to uh, uh, that's the way to do an interrogation. So it was not just illegal; it was bad policy, in my opinion. So when military officials would not change these things, uh, I'm in my dorm room. I'm doing this pretty much alone, and my thought process is that two of my roommates at the Air Force Academy have been killed in Vietnam during the last 2 or 3 years. I don't know why God put me in this position that I have these insights, but uh, if I don't publicize it, it's never going to change. So I did. And when the book came out, I was invited to be on 60 Minutes. I swear I never heard of 60 Minutes. I'm in a dorm room laboring on this paper so much that even when the NYU students went home for Christmas, I didn't go home for Christmas. I stayed all over Christmas to finish this paper before I had to go back on active duty. So, as you can see, I did appear on 60 Minutes on a Monday morning at McGuire Air Force Base in my uniform. I had not seen 60 Minutes till the night before I left the Gettysburg battlefield on a tour to go to a motel to see what 60 Minutes was like. And I do the format. So what you see on that 60 Minutes film is unrehearsed and authentic in the sense that that's what I thought and believed at the time. But I was actually angry because I saw hypocrisy in professing to adhere to the Constitution, obey the law, and even be honorable. I mean, like pulling people out of the bed in the middle of the night. The superintendent of the Air Force Academy held a press conference and wrote an article in our alumni magazine saying I was not correct. What do you mean it's not correct? So I wound up concluding, well, not only are they not obeying the law, they're lying. And they know better than this because they taught us not to do it. And as a young man, this is very, you talk about cognitive dissonance. It's like, so anyway, there are other, things that I've done with the law. For example, I'm the named plaintiff on the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision in the Freedom of Information Act in 1975. And when the Air Force Academy would not give me a copy of the 1 or 2 page summaries of honor cases with the names redacted, I didn't want names, but I wanted to be able to show in this law review article what people have been thrown out for, because I didn't think the public would believe some of the things that people have been thrown out for, that at the Navy, Coast Guard, Merchant Marine Academy, they would not probably been thrown out for. So I had to make a decision. So 2 law review editors and I sued under the Freedom of Information Act. It went to get a copy of the documents the Air Force Academy would not provide, and the decision favorable to us at the Supreme Court required the Air Force Academy to provide the documents, and it didn't hurt a thing. But what it established was, as a precedent with the new Freedom of Information Act, is redaction, which means the government cannot withhold a document just because somebody's name is in the document. Instead, they got to redact it or blacken it or razor blade it out, and that's called the Rhodes process in the federal government, or at least it was. I don't know if it is now or not. So I have sued or filed complaints successfully against state and local governments many times. And I filed another lawsuit against the Air Force, which it settled on terms I considered favorable, but which I can't reveal, for violations of the Privacy Act. So as our complaint showed, there was an officer at the Air Force Academy who was keeping 15 years or so of records of my activities, my First Amendment activities in violation of the Privacy Act, and this would spill over to hurt me in various ways. In other words, I was being canceled. When we did discovery and got the evidence, like I said, the case was settled. I didn't really want to sue anybody, but I came down to if we don't press, then our government's not going to be accountable, and it would be almost immoral for me to overlook all this when I had the means of doing something about it. Now, with regard to stars today, we discovered that the uh, DoD suspended the boards of visitors of West Point, the Naval Academy, and the Air Force Academy. So I
Yes, they
reasoned,
did.
well, yeah, well, Congress created the boards of visitors as oversight boards. So how can the executive branch cancel or suspend or stop the operation of a congressionally created oversight board? So we filed a lawsuit challenging that. About 11 days later, the boards of visitors were unsuspended. So that just tells me the Justice Department lawyers must have read the lawsuit and agreed that that was illegal. But then President Biden fired all the Trump appointees. First time in history any president's fired the already existing members of the Board of Visitors. And we are challenging that and replace them with Biden appointees who the Biden press secretary said were people who shared our values, unlike the Trump appointees. So we have in our lawsuit, still pending, now before the U.S. Supreme Court on a petition for writ of certiorari. We have in our lawsuit challenging the firing of the Trump appointees because Congress created staggered terms and these boards of visitors are supposed to be balanced politically, not just skewed politically based on the latest election. And there's a third thing I'm packing on subcommittees, non-members of the Board of Visitors, uh, as another technique to what? Neutralize the boards of visitors so they can't provide oversight. So what? So that DEI can be put into the academies without it being scrutinized. So that's something we challenge. Now, we filed a lawsuit challenging the legality of the COVID vaccine mandate in the military. Don't think, uh, don't assume just because the military mandates taking a vaccine that it's legal. In fact, a federal court uh, stopped, enjoined the anthrax vaccine mandate as being illegal years ago. So now we got a COVID vaccine mandate, and the military has thrown out thousands, at least 8,500 uh, people, military members, for not taking the COVID vaccine who had religious objections that even the military agreed were sincere. So, 8 federal courts have ruled that the military's denial of those religious exemption requests and punishing people for not taking the COVID vaccine despite the religious exemption request violated the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a federal statute. Now, I'm just mystified as to how military officers who take the oath to support and defend the Constitution can and do, in my view, violate the law. 8 federal courts said they were violating the law, and they're
Yeah.
punishing people for
Well,
uh, upholding their rights.
well, Mike, let me just go back real quickly. The Board of Visitors, for our viewers, are individuals who are appointed to advise the president on activities of the military academies. But the president doesn't appoint all those people, does he? He has a couple of people, as I recall, about 6 that I think he picks. Then there are others that are picked by Congress and people at large. But the President of the United States doesn't have the authority, does he, to fire all of them or any of them that he just doesn't like?
Well, let me say this about that. First of all, the statute doesn't just require that the Board of Visitors report to the president. It requires that it report to the Congress, specifically to the Senate Armed Services
Yes.
Committee and the House Armed Services Committee. So this oversight board could have been created just as a 100% congressional report only to Congress, but they chose, okay, we're going to let the executive branch in on it too. But this is not created by the executive branch. It was created by Congress, and so uh, the uh, there had never been a firing by a president of the already existing members of a board of visitors, and we believe it's illegal. But the Biden administration claims that it is legal. I mean, the Biden administration claims that forgiving student loans is legal too, but the courts overrule it. Hardly a week goes by without the court overruling something
Yeah,
that
that's
the Biden
true.
administration is doing. So I actually rewrote the legislation for the boards of visitors, and Congressman Waltz introduced it in the NDAA law, which passed the House, that would eliminate the executive branch from making an appointment. So the way the law is right now, Congress makes some of the appointments and the president makes some of the appointments, and it's supposed to be balanced and balanced through staggered terms and balanced politically. But the legislation I wrote that passed the House would delete the executive branch, the president, from any appointments. So if the president wants to create oversight committees for the academies, go ahead and create all you want. But since you're interfering in three fundamental ways, neutering the congressionally created boards of visitors, we'll just delete the presidential appointees altogether, and we won't have the problem anymore. And Congress can do its inspector general type oversight. So, but there's just many examples of this on an ongoing basis. I've represented maybe over 1,000, certainly hundreds of military people in my career, probably 100 just regarding the COVID vaccine itself, including at all 5 academies. And at all levels of the chain of command, there are injustices. It's not just injustice. I look at the law violation. I can honestly say I've never represented anybody, especially in the military, that I didn't think was morally right, in addition to being legally right. But my theory is if you're on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the most elitist and let's say wealthy and influential, and 0 or 1 being the most impoverished, if you start out as an 8, then you won't have an internal appreciation of the effect of political decisions on the people that are 2, 3, or 4 or lower that you would have if you grew up a 1, 2, 3, or 4 yourself. And that's why I
Well, it sounds
question even
like
the all.
that adequately describes your case, I think, Mike.
Well,
Growing up the way you
yeah,
did.
well, that's right. And that's why I question the all volunteer military uh, because, which was done out of political expediency, but I question it because I would like the decision makers at the top to have their children and grandchildren invested or affected by the decisions they make. So if President Biden, for example, can send the military to war, but Hunter doesn't have to go to war, uh, and this was happening even in Vietnam when it wasn't all volunteer, even with the draft. I mean, I'm at NYU Law School surrounded by people that had one maneuver after another to get out of the draft. And even in the Civil War, there were literally riots that the American Army had to put down in New York City because for $300 you could get out of the draft. And the poor people uh, did not tolerate, they rioted because they weren't wanting to be drafted to die in a war that the people that were wealthier and more powerful weren't invested in. So, in any event, um, my motivation, which I didn't start out, I was going to be an Air Force JAG. That's what I thought. I was going to be an Air Force officer. And
Yeah,
uh, from being an Eagle Scout and Boy Scouts and in Charleston, living near a naval base, being surrounded by military people, my family being military, I had a reverence, a respect uh, for the military. My minister at my church advocated I become a minister. In fact, at 14 years old, he had me give a sermon to the congregation. I don't know any 14-year-olds in retrospect that gives a sermon to the congregation. But my
yeah,
calling
very
was
few.
to be a military officer in my mind. And it wasn't until my third year at the Air Force Academy, when I took 3 law courses and got around lawyers for the first time, that I changed my perspective. That I no longer wanted to be a pilot. I wanted to be a lawyer. And I figured, well, I could do more to help. I'm fascinated by the law. If I just learn these rules and I have the personality to apply them, then I can help control my own life, but influence and help other people with their problems in their lives. So it's sort of like being a minister, except it's not in church. It's applying the law. And that turned out to be very true. Also, if I were a pilot, I would have to at that time retire at 60 and maybe earlier if my health went out. But if I'm a lawyer, I could be 77 years old like I am right now and still practicing law, doing what I love. So that was my reasoning where I went to law school instead of pilot training.
And you wouldn't have had to deal with the FAA either.
I wouldn't have to deal with
the FAA is a pilot. Yeah, that's always a governmental restriction on what you do. You don't have nearly as much problem as an attorney, I guess. So listen, it sounds like, but it sounds like also that religion, sounds like religion was a very big part of your life too. How did your faith shape your decision making during your career?
Well, I grew up, I went to a rural Baptist church, my grandfather in Kentucky, but in South Carolina, when I moved there, I was going to church 3 times a week. I'm around conservative people. In our high school, in our school, we would say the Pledge of Allegiance and have a devotion every morning. That was my psychic frame of reference. So I believed in God. I believed in our Constitution, our country, our freedom. And it wasn't until more recent years that I started hearing claims of being a Christian nationalist and the things that we thought were good are really supposedly the opposite. But I will say, look, I have grandchildren who went to college and say they're 100 miles away, and if they forgot their notebook, they call their mom, and their mom meets them halfway and delivers it to them. Well, when I went to 4 years, 4 different colleges in 4 different states, I didn't know a soul. And whatever I arrived with, I was, that was it. So I was alone. And writing this law review article, I was alone. Well, I wasn't alone. I had people around me that supported it. I had people in the military support it. But what I'm saying is, this isn't like being a member of STARS where we got a like-minded group. So what would keep me going to that? I had to have faith that I identified a noble, positive motivation for what I was doing, and that I should hang in there and have faith that it'll all turn out okay. You know, when I filed that lawsuit in the Freedom of Information Act, I had no way of knowing whether we would win. Look at it from the Air Force's standpoint. I'm on a leave of absence as a captain in the Air Force, going to law school, and now I'm investigating them. I'm writing about them, and now I'm suing them. So I can understand how there were people very upset about it. Certainly the Air Force Academy was. But I just had the attitude that I've thought about it, I've searched, I've researched, I've discussed it. This is for their own good. And when smoke clears away, it'll be better. And it was. So there were certain changes made. The redaction, the Freedom of Information Act is positive. The precedent for our country, probably all 50 states have adopted Freedom of Information Acts. They have redaction as their policy. Every time you hear redaction on the TV, news, it comes from that case. And so on and so on. And so General Bishop, Rod Bishop, the chairman of the board of STARS, and I helped get reinstated to the Coast Guard Academy. 5 cadets have been thrown out for not taking the COVID vaccine. To my surprise, the only one of the 5 academies that threw any cadets out for not taking a COVID vaccine was the Coast Guard Academy, and they were very mean-spirited, in my opinion, in the way they did it. They didn't have to do it the way they did it at all. But 5 returned, and General Bishop and I went to the graduation of 2 of them. We helped get a cadet now at the Air Force Academy reinstated who had been, uh, she's thrown out for failing a urine analysis test. And then 5 months later, all branches of the service have a written announcement they're no longer using the test because it's defective, because poppy seeds can cause a false positive. Well, this cadet had shown she had taken poppy seeds in a muffin the day before, so she lost. So this is just another example of don't assume that things are right just because they're or legal just because it's being done. So my objective as I went through my journey was to get is enough education and enough exposure to, let's say, the I don't know if I'd say the elite, but the people who, enough exposure to the rest of the world that I could independently evaluate the facts myself and not be dependent upon the propaganda or spin or gaslighting of somebody else or something else. And I think I achieved that exact objective. But when I graduated from Harvard Business School, basically there was nothing else to go to. It's like that to me was the pinnacle of education. And I'd started 4 businesses, I'd done this, I'd done that. So now I just had to live my life and came to South Carolina to visit and wound up staying. Now, I became a South Carolina state senator. I had no idea whatsoever of becoming running for office until 1986. So I'm going to tell you how that happened because I think it's an interesting story.
Sure
As of
is.
1986, I had done 4 things in my life independently in different parts of the country that had generated national publicity. So I had a knack for promotion, or some would say self-promotion. And I can't sing and I can't run. There's a lot of things I can't do, but I can communicate, I can write, I can speak. And
Yeah.
so in 1986 in the summer, I saw on ABC News an Iowa farmer. There was a big drought in South Carolina. So farmers were having to sell their cows. The cows were dying. So I saw on ABC News an Iowa farmer offer free hay to a South Carolina farmer if he could get it here in South Carolina. So the next day, I started working as a volunteer on my initiative with the Commission on Agriculture of South Carolina, and I created a program called FARM, F-A-R-M, Farmers Assistance Relief Mission. So we raised money for farmers to bring hay to South Carolina. And I created a program called the Adopt-A-Cow program, the Adopt-A-Cow program. So we told people at a press conference that if you'll give us $140, which is roughly the cost of hay during the duration of the drought effects over 8 months, if you'll give us $140, we'll give you a certificate signed by the governor of South Carolina showing you've officially adopted a genuine South Carolina cow. Well, we got
Right.
checks from 38 states in 60 days. An Army battalion in Germany adopted a cow. Elementary schools adopted a cow. The mayor of Anchorage, Alaska adopted a cow. I have an office next to the Commission on Agriculture. The phone rings and I hear, Mr. Rose, we think your Adopt-A-Cow program is very moving. Or we think what you're doing is utterly fantastic. And I'd say, well, we're going to milk it for all it's worth. Well, this got in USA Today, Wall Street Journal, every newspaper in the state of South Carolina, and state politicians started coming over to me that I didn't know to see what this is all about. But here's what I'm leading up to. So I'm standing in a room, sort of like this, with the Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina next to me and the Commission on Agriculture to my right. And understand, I've created this program out of thin air, just total thin air. And the Lieutenant Governor says to me, Mike, do you have any idea how we can find out what federal programs are available for our farmers? And I said, yeah, there's 2 ways to do it. You call Thurman and Holling's office, the senators, and ask them to research it. But the other way is, why don't you call the President of the American Red Cross? Mike Rose was in Hurricane Camille, Biloxi, Mississippi, 1969. I worked for the Red Cross in the afternoon and evening. And I could tell you that Red Cross has got this disaster stuff down pat. Why don't you call the president of the American Red Cross? Lieutenant Governor then said to me, Mike, do you mind if I speak to the president of the American Red Cross? No, you're the lieutenant governor. I want you to. Just stand there. So I walk over to the phone, dial the 202 information operator in Washington, and get the number for the Red Cross. I dial the number for the Red Cross. I asked the switchboard operator, I said, the lieutenant governor of South Carolina would like to speak to the president of the American Red Cross. President of the American Red Cross gets on the phone. I hand the phone to the lieutenant governor, and they talk for 45 minutes. That whole time I stood there stunned. And I told myself, wait a minute, I can do that. For 15 years, yes. I've been going to elected officials trying to get things done, and now they're asking me how to do it, and now I'm doing it for them. What do I need them for? I didn't get married till I was 38 years old, and I had just been married. So I walked out and I called my new wife, and I said, Vivian, I don't know what political party I'm in, but I'm joining a party. Because I just had the mystique of being an elected official disappeared in that meeting. I realized, wait a minute, I got the skills, I can do this. And so what happened is I wound up interviewing the people who were head in my county of the Republican and Democrat Party. And I'd say, well, what do you stand for? And I basically got gobbledygook. So then I looked it up, and they both parties sounded good. But what I realized is I really couldn't join the Democrat Party. What they stood for was keeping their jobs in the courthouse, and they were the majority, and they didn't need my help, and they didn't want my help. Now, the Republicans were on the outside looking in, and they would take whatever they could get, and they started having monthly meetings. So I started going there. I ran for state senator, and I won. And so even how did I do that? I went to the College of Charleston, or maybe it was a Citadel, and checked out 7 books on how to run campaign and read them. And so it was like starting a business, except this was a campaign. So now, I remember, I don't really visibly cry much, but when I left our Senate, my first 2 sessions, and drove 100 miles back to my home, I had tears coming down, thinking about the impact I realized I could have as a state senator. Far more than just a lawyer whose maneuvering ability was limited. When you think about it, I didn't get rid of the silence because of the law. I mean, I had the law as a basis. I got a front page article in the New York Times in June of 1974 about the silence. And then it wound up on 60 Minutes with me. And 2 months later in August, out of embarrassment, West Point held a press conference. So what I concluded is the only way to get these changes made is embarrassment or fear of embarrassment. But as a state senator, I wrote to every agency in the state before I had my first session saying, I'm new. Could you have somebody in your department meet with me, because I got to vote on your budget. I'd like to know more about how the Department of Transportation operates or whatever it is. Well, every one of them had the department head meet with me. They weren't going to have some underling. I just didn't realize how significant South Carolina being a state senator was. And what I discovered is that I could solve 2 types of problems and macro and micro. So micro was cutting through the bureaucracy to help people get the government to serve them. And there was just a myriad of ways. But the value I was able to add that most other senators couldn't is structural, macro. And I'm going to give a couple examples of that. But what I did is I studied what other states did. If I read an article about some state was doing something and it sounded like a good idea in South Carolina, I made it my business to import this stuff to South Carolina. I introduced more legislation each of my 13 years than any senator except one, and he was a committee chairman. And even if I thought something would not pass, like I thought we should have the initiative and the referendum, and I researched there are three types, and we weren't going to have the California type, but we could have the more conservative type. Um, and even if I knew it wouldn't pass, I created for a permanent public record how to do it. And what I discovered is South Carolina has, for example, the strongest legislative branch of any of the 50 states and the weakest executive branch, the weakest governor. Montana has the opposite, strongest governor, weakest legislative branch. I would go to the state Senate clerk in Texas and do a 2-hour tape recorded interview asking how is it that the Texas Senate, which meets only every other year, and has if you're in a bigger and more complex state than South Carolina, how is it that your state in Texas gets more done meeting every other year than my state of South Carolina gets done meeting once a year, and each once a year we're meeting longer than you meet every other year. And I found it was because of culture and rules. And what I mean by that, well, in South Carolina, any senator could introduce 100 amendments and filibuster every one of them. So effectively, they could block almost anything. And unless you got a real supermajority to override it, you never get away with that in Texas. In Texas, it's limited. And in Texas, the most powerful politician I learned was the lieutenant governor. He was head of the Senate and had a written agenda at the beginning of each term every other year, but he could appoint a committee chairman. If you can appoint a committee chairman, you can get a lot of legislation passed. Now, I got a lot of legislation passed. At the end of my second year as a senator, I went on stage in Boston and got an award as one of the 3 best legislators in the U.S. before by the American Legislative Exchange Council, before a group of legislators, bipartisan, both parties in all 50 states. And that's because in my first 2 years, I'd introduced 8 bills that got passed into law, which they said was more than most legislators did in their lifetime. But I want to illustrate just how backward some of the stuff in our state was now, and how I personally was able to improve it. Now, I represented 3 towns, Hanahan, Goose Creek, and Somerville. And the senator determined who the governor was going to appoint as magistrates. Magistrates were judges, and they had a lot of power. But none of the magistrates in those 3 cities were lawyers, not one. So I figured if you're going to apply the law, that you need to have a lawyer in there anyway.
So that makes sense, yeah.
Got a lawyer appointed to all 3 towns. Well, you would have thought I was a member of the Taliban. There were people that didn't. See, what I discovered is with a general population, this isn't like the military. By definition, the average person is average, which means half of them are below average in terms of intellect, drive, ambition, character, whatever it is. So they don't necessarily understand or connect the dots. So why are you putting a lawyer in there? So now, I'll tell you why I'm putting a lawyer in there. I am absolutely not exaggerating this. Yep. One of the magistrates in Goose Creek put a rotating blue light and siren in his car and would stop and arrest people, for speeding, stuff like that. Well, that's not what a judge is supposed to do. So when I heard it, I confronted him. He produced an 1832 law in South Carolina that said the magistrates are required to arrest anybody committing a crime in their presence. So I got that law repealed, and I got rid of that magistrate. And I mean, the magistrate stops at night a couple with 2 children for littering and has the wife and 2 children standing there while the husband's going down the road to pick the trash up. That's how screwed up this guy is. Now, let me tell you this second practice. You're going to really laugh when you hear this. The sheriff in my county had the diet program. Literally, the county council gave the sheriff money to pay for prisoner food. And whatever he didn't spend, he got to keep his personal income. Let me repeat that. The sheriff had a financial incentive to shortchange the prisoners' food, and he called it the diet program. So I introduced a
I can
bill
see
to
why.
ban that. And no, the Sheriff's Association comes out of the woodwork opposing it because you're going to decrease the income of this sheriff. And it turns out another county in the state was doing the same thing. Now, when I asked our local sheriff how much money he was making due to the diet program, he said, "Oh, no, I'm not really making anything." Okay, well, then you don't mind me banish it. Oh, no, I'm going to lose a lot of income if you banish it. So to get this to pass, I had to put in the bill that the county would determine how much money the sheriff made from the diet program over the previous 3 years, take the average, and increase permanently the salary of the sheriff by that amount. See, what I did is I had probably thousands of instances where I'd read the legislation, stand before a Senate and say, I know what you're trying to do, but this language doesn't do it. So, and not only that, it creates this other problem. So I reworded it this way. I gained a reputation where people trusted me, and I was able to have,
Yeah.
I think, an inordinate amount of influence, especially as a junior senator, because in our legislature, in our Senate, it was all the seniority system. So the people who have been around 30 or 40 years are the ones that were the committee chairman. My wife and I were driving from Reno to Las Vegas, Nevada. Every dinky little town I came to, there was an arrow that said Senior Citizen Center, pointing somewhere to it. So I wondered, well, why does Goose Creek have a Senior Citizen Center, but my town of Somerville doesn't? And what I found out is that Senior Citizen Center in Nevada were financed by casino money, which we don't have in South
Yeah.
Carolina. But I got legislation passed allowing the local town or county to have a referendum on whether people wanted to tax themselves to get a senior citizen center. And as a result, Somerville now has a very good senior citizen center. And I want to give you one last example because I can give many more examples. But this is the most significant structural change, not only that I made, but the most significant structural change, I think, in South Carolina's government since Reconstruction. I discovered when I became a senator that South Carolina has a peculiar form of government called the delegation system, the county legislative delegation system. And it turns out Alabama and Georgia have the same thing. Now, here's how this works. In 47 states, there are 4 layers of government: federal, state, county, city. Federal, state, county, city. Well, in Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, there are 5 uh, levels of government: federal, state, county, city, and county legislative delegation. Now, here's how this works. If any state senator or state house member represents any of the geographic area of a county, like my county, then they're deemed to be on this committee called the county legislative delegation. And they have enormous powers to allocate money, replace members of the school board who resign, and this sort of thing. Not in our Constitution, but all by statute. There's not a word in our Constitution about county legislative delegation. Now, the problem with this is that every member of the delegation, that is, every senator and every House member, represented a different amount of population within the county, but had the same one vote. So I said, now let me get this straight. I'm new here. There's 7 people on my Dorchester County delegation. I'm one of them, and you're 2 of them. And I live in the county, and I represent 100,000 people. But you don't live in the county; you live in an adjoining county. But and the a little territory in Dorchester County you represent is uninhabited swampland. So you 2 have 1 vote each or 2, and you don't live here. You don't represent anybody. And I've got 1 only vote, and I live here and I represent 100,000 people. Well, yeah, that's the system. And then they gerrymandered it, the Democrats did, to make sure that the Democrats dominated the county delegation and the money and the appointment. So I advocated that almost all the powers of the delegation need to be transferred to the city and the county councils. Why? Well, all those members live in the counties. They live in their towns, and they represent equal population because they got single member districts. So why have somebody? You understand that three counties converged where I live. So now I'm on three county delegation. Instead of working on just statewide problems, I got to go 20 miles to Charleston, South Carolina to sit in a meeting on who's going to be appointed to the Charleston County Veterans Board Commission, where we have attendees from Beaufort, Georgetown, Moncks Corner, and Somerville, which are many miles away, and it's sometimes not even in the county. And it was a ridiculous waste of time. So when I couldn't get the politically this changed, I filed a lawsuit in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, in federal court, and on behalf of plaintiffs from three counties. Anyway, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the Constitution required weighted voting, that every delegation member's vote was going to count only in proportion amount of total population in the county they represented. So if they represented nobody, they got 0% vote. If they represented 1/10 of 1%, they got 1/10 1% vote. Well, suddenly it wasn't fun to be on a delegation anymore if you didn't have much power. Now, this is the important thing. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the origin of this delegation system was racial discrimination during Reconstruction, that the white folks were so afraid of a black governor that they created, number one, they created over 100 commissions to diffuse the power. They created a weak governor and a strong legislature, and they created this delegation system to further diffuse the power. Now, one of the first laws I got passed was to repeal a law still in our books prohibiting blacks and whites from riding the school bus together. That was still on the South Carolina's books in 1990. Another law I got passed was repealing the law still in the books prohibiting blacks and whites from going to public school together. A footnote saying Brown versus the board overrode that. Well, then why do we have it still in our law? I will say also, my first 2 years as a senator, there was an FBI sting called Operation Lost Trust. You can Google Operation Lost Trust and see within 2 years, about 20% of our legislature was in jail, and for participating in bribery. And so I'm now going from the high standards of the Air Force Academy to being among colleagues who were indicted and going to jail. And you may laugh when you hear this because I'm just all over the place, but I hope this is interesting at least. I stood before a state senate 3 times and I said, I have a problem here, and I know you have a problem, but I'm going to tell you what it is. During my formative development stage as a teenager, I went to the Air Force Academy, and inscribed in our class ring, and I hold it up, is our class motto, Esse non videre. Esse non videre. Esse non videre means to be, not to seem. To be, not to seem. My problem is, ever since I got in the legislature, it's as if the motto were the opposite. To seem, not to be. It's a 180-degree culture clash. In the Air Force, it's very concrete. You either had enough fuel to go home or you didn't. You either dropped the bomb the right place or off the right time you didn't. But here in the legislature, we say, you see that black wall over there? It's really not a wall. It just looks like one. And even if it were a wall, it's not black. So every day I'm hearing obfuscations, distortions, exaggerations, and downright lies. And I know you know what you're saying is lying. That's like taking a fork and scraping it across the blackboard to me. That is my problem. There's Operation Lost Trust.
Don't you think now that, but now that we've got, and particularly now in an election cycle, there's kind of a paucity of substance and a lot of talk and hot air about what people want to do or don't want to do. But you're exactly right. It's the doers that have the ability to identify problems and find solutions. And as you say, and you're so good at it, being innovative in doing it. Anybody can go along to get along. Anybody can sit at their desk all day long and let the rules and regulations and instructions play out. It's very few people who can be good and creative enough, I think, to solve problems. And I think that's what you're pointing out, Mike, and you've done a great job with that. And we try to do that here at STARS, I think, and we're making some progress on it because ours is an educational mission, as you know. We try to get the ideas and substance to people about what's happening, particularly with the military right now. But I would also suggest that it's a larger problem with our society, as you've pointed out, where people get in little fiefdoms and they forget about law, they forget about honor and duty and country. And that's what STARS is about. So we're kind of getting close to the end, I think, here, Mike. But I'd offer, can you kind of wrap this up a little bit from the standpoint of law and order and what we do, even with politics, which is not to say that we all can't talk about it, but it is something that's real to all of us. We live in it, and those are real problems with solutions today. Any thoughts on solutions for the military, for instance?
I do. Uh, Now, our culture of traditional values, our constitution's under attack and deliberate attack. This all started in Russia, Germany, migrated to the US through Columbia University and academia, but as the long march to the institutions and now these leftist ideologies have been infused into the military, and it's changed the culture in a extremely destructive way.
Yep.
The military culture when I entered the Air Force was it didn't matter what your background was. We were all on the same team, and we're going to be judged by our character and merit and our competence. And we have the ability to compete for advancement. And for people of humble beginnings, that was about as a good an opportunity that existed anywhere. But that's been transformed now to judge people not by their character, as Martin Luther King would say, but by their skin color or their gender, and to subordinate merit to uh, uh, external characteristics like skin color and gender. And that has caused uh, dramatically lower recruitment, retention, lower morale, lower effectiveness.
Mm-hmm.
The standards had to be lowered to accommodate the people that couldn't meet the standards that were brought into the military because of on the basis of factors other than merit. So uh, I understand from a my original background was sort of like just think of J.D. Vance, except I would say in terms of poverty, with the nearest town 10 miles away, the nearest paved road 2 miles away, that I'm
Yep.
sort of more J.D. Vance story than he is. The point is, though, is that if you see the opportunity for advancement, even these people enlisted in the military, this was a great opportunity for them to see the world and get gainful employment, an opportunity to advance and a retirement and serve their country. But what happens is if people don't believe in the system anymore, if they don't believe in their leaders, they don't have confidence, they don't have the reverence
Yep.
for academy graduates that my Kentucky relatives did. They don't trust their competent. And look, this whole thing's like Bud Light. There's going to be a rural rebellion in this election, a rural rebellion. I read that term this week, and I think it's very appropriate. Those people in Western North Carolina who are not getting government assistance that have been wiped out by Hurricane Helene, uh, those people in those mountain hollows are just like Kentucky and Tennessee and West Virginia. And they're rugged individualists. They have a mentality. It's like when Cornwallis sent uh, an army during the Revolutionary War to go uh, conquer the rural people in those areas unless they paid homage to King George and Cornwallis. These these mountain people mobilized themselves and surrounded the British army at the Battle of Kings Mountain and wiped them out. And then they went home.
Yeah.
They weren't they weren't fighting for independence. They were fighting because they were insulted, and they were attack verbally. So these proud people aren't into transgenderism. They aren't into having some of these parties that they consider decadent. And the military is facing now what Bud Light did. That the Bud Light new marketeers catered to a minority leftist population, thereby alienating their big base. And that's precisely what's happening in the military, is that people like me joined the military because our relatives recommended it or spoke highly of it, and we thought there was a noble purpose to support and defend our Constitution, have the rule of law, have freedom, have all these things that we enjoy, the Bill of Rights. And if the ideology, the changes to the left, so that people were taught to believe that the military is bad, and our country's bad, our Constitution's bad, needs to be transformed and replaced. I'll give you an example. Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeyer wrote his book, Irresistible Revolution, and he describes how, as a squadron commander, now he's one of the top, if not the top, lieutenant colonel in the Air Force or Space Force at that time. He had been the aide de camp, there's only one of them, to a 4-star general who became head of the Space Force. So he was destined undoubtedly to be a general, but he has expertise on China, and he recognized as a squadron commander in Colorado that when he interviewed people getting out of the Air Force, the white people said, he'd say, well, why are you leaving? I'm leaving because I'm tired of being called racist, and as he describes in his book. And then the black people would say basically, well, I wanted to serve my country, but I didn't realize how racist and bad it was until I got in the Air Force and they taught me. So that. So I'm saying, if you change the brand, look, people didn't smoke Marlboro cigarettes because they liked the cigarettes as much as they liked the image of the Marlboro man. So if you change the image and you change to drag shows and these kind of things, I assure you that these rural people in the Southeast who have traditionally enlisted aren't going to have military service recommended to them, and they're not going to join, and they're going to get out of their earliest opportunity. And it's weakened. Heritage Foundation says the military is weak. The Air Force is the weakest. There's just lots of data. Even the Wall Street Journal. I saw this morning an article dated yesterday about the severe shortages in recruitment and retention in the military and performance. We have 17 Navy ships, I read, that can't be used because we don't have enough Navy sailor manpower to man them. We have Air Force air wings that aren't functioning at standards. Look, our country will not have our freedoms and its opportunities and its way of life unless our military is strong. If that is defeated, then we'll transform to socialism, communism, and the standards, just like in the last 4 years, the standards of the masses of the middle class have declined. Well, they'll decline precipitously anymore. And this is why I understand this enough until I consider what I'm doing with STARS to be the most important endeavor in my life. And furthermore, I consider the leaders of STARS who I work with to be the most, not just skilled people of great character, but noble and talented and what's the word I'm looking for?
Productive, maybe.
Well, productive is part of it, but what I'm saying is I worked for 4 years as a volunteer in this organization because I understand. Look, if I could just be a sheep and just grazing and let a shepherd take care of me, well, then that'd be one thing. But that's not the case. I see a clear and present imminent danger in this election. Now,
Yes.
I'm speaking, everything I've said here is not STARS, officially for STARS, even though I'm an officer in STARS. It's my personal opinion. But we have a fork in the road here. Are we going to right the ship with President Trump, or are we going to go further left? And if we do go further left for the next 4 years, if Kamala's elected, then I doubt that we can resuscitate what we had, which is what they want. But what President Trump will do, I think should do, is to reinstate his, if he becomes elected, on day one, reinstate his executive order that he had previously that Biden rescinded, but now reinstated, banning DEI throughout the federal government. And secondly, Matthew Lohmeyer appeared a couple of weeks or so ago in a press conference with President Trump and got to ask him a question along with 6 other veterans. And when it's Matthew's turn, he asked President Trump if he became president again, would he fire the generals who are imposing DEI, this onerous thing on the military? President Trump interrupted him and said, they're gone, they're gone. And then he said, and would you create in the Pentagon an entity of some kind that will monitor the getting rid of the onerous DEI throughout the military on an ongoing basis? And President Trump's response is that he was going to appoint you, Matthew Lohmeyer, the first person to that committee. Yes, I'll create that committee and you're going to be appointed to it. And I understand his staff have followed up to prepare Matthew Lohmeyer to be able to do that. So this is what is needed. And to hound and look, they're going to have to reassign what Obama did when he tried to transform our country, including our military, is he basically purged the top generals that weren't leftist. This is my perception, and retained and installed people that would get with their DEI program. So President Trump's going to have to do the opposite. You know, whether he fires anybody or not, I don't know, but you can always transfer them and put them wherever you want. You got to get people in positions of authority and power that can get rid of this DEI.
Yeah. Diego Garcia might be a good place to start with some reassignments. or maybe Adak, Alaska. Well, Mike, listen, we've probably solved some of the problems of the world here today, but I want to tell you how grateful we here at STARS are for having you as our general counsel. But not only that, as another one of our leaders who've gone through the crucible of the academies, learned about integrity and honor and duty, and I know you're still practicing it as I try to, but we've got a lot of work that can be done to straighten the country out. And now it's time for people to do that. So to our audience, we're only a few days away from the election. If you have not gone out to vote yet, please do it. And if you want a little bit more information about Mike and his career and what we're doing here at STARS, go to stars.us, our website, and you can see what we're doing. You can also see our archive of podcasts that we've done in the past here. And with that, I'm going to say thank you, Mike, for being with us tonight. And thank you to the audience for being with us again on a very special edition of Stars and Stripes. And we'll see you next week.
Al?
Good night.
Al, I'd like to say something else if I could.
Sure.
I just don't want to leave this out. I checked my notes. Here's a couple other things that should happen if President Trump is reelected. If Congress becomes the Republican majority in particular, Congress should pass a law banning DEI, which is even stronger than an executive order. And the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14, states that Congress has the power to make rules for the regulation of the military. Also, there could be some very quick, tangible fixes to show there's a new sheriff in town, like getting rid of the purple cords by cadets at the academies.
Yeah,
And
that's a
these,
good start.
these people that have been thrown out, these people that have been thrown out for not taking a COVID vaccine illegally, according to 8 federal courts, there could be reinstatement, back pay. President Ford at the end of Vietnam created by executive order a commission to evaluate requests for a pardon for the crime of avoiding the draft, and he gave many pardons. President President Trump could create such a board, process all these requests for back pay, reinstatement, and so forth, and get this done. So I just checked my notes a moment ago. I just at the end here, I wanted to plant the seed in this podcast for some of those ideas. Thank you.
Well, Mike, listen, I think that's exactly what we need to do. Finding solutions and finding good, sensible procedures for what we do rather than people sitting on their hands waiting for something to happen. And then thanks again, Mike, for being with us, to our audience. We'll see you again later. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.